Hey everybody, you're watching ASMR Angel Reads. We're going to continue with Daggerspell. We're on chapter 3. I just want to do a recap of what we read so far. The first chapter we met all the main characters: Jill, her father Cullen, a guy named Rodri who ends up going the long road with them both, and of course the main character, the centuries old man, Nevin. In chapter 2 was the first life they had before being reincarnated, and Nevin was Galrion, and he was going to marry Bragawin, who was Jill, but his dad caught him doing the Dwemer, which is magic, and exiled him from the kingdom and changed his name to Nevin, which means no one or nothing. And so since he couldn't marry Bragawin, Bragawin and her brother Garrett had an incestuous relationship, and she got pregnant, and so she threw herself in the river because she couldn't live with herself. Her brother also committed suicide, and then hold on one second. And then Blaine, who is Rodri, was trying to get with Bragawin, but he was too late. So, chapter 3 is kind of short, so I'm going to try to get through the whole thing. So hopefully it's not too long. Chapter 3 doesn't have chapter names, it just gives the year. Devery 1058. If a man could claim the Dwemer, he must learn patience above all else. No fruit falls from a tree before it's ripe. So early in the spring, the river water ran cold. Giggling and splashing, Jill jumped up and down in the shallows until she could bear to kneel on the sandy bottom. Curious wild folk clustered around, faces that appeared in the ripples, sleek silver forms that darted like fish, while she washed her hair as well as she could without soap. She never worried before about being clean, but lately it had grown important. Once she was done, she rolled on the grassy bank like a horse to get dry, then hurried back to camp among the old hazel trees. Out in the meadow beyond, her gray pony and Da's warhorse were grazing quietly. Cullen himself was still over at a nearby farmhouse buying food. Jill rushed to get dressed before he returned. Just lately, it was troubling to think of Da seeing her without any clothes on. Before she put on her shirt, she looked at her chest and the two definite swellings of little breasts. At times she wished that they would just go away. She was 13, an ominous age since many girls married at 14. Hurriedly she pulled on the shirt and belted it in, then rummaged in the saddlebag and found a comb and a fragment of a cracked mirror. The gray gnome all along, nose and warts, materialized next to her. When Jill held up the mirror to him, he looked behind it as if searching for the rest of the gnome he saw there. "That's you. See, there's your nose." The bewildered creature merely sighed and hunkered down on the grass next to her. "If it was bigger, maybe you'd understand. Da said he'd buy me a proper mirror for my birthday, but I don't want one. Stupid town lasses primp all the time, but I'm a silver dagger's daughter." The gnome nodded agreement and scratched his armpit. When Cullen returned, they set out riding for Dunmananana, a coastal town on the eastern border of Devery province. It turned out to be a collection of wooden houses that straggled along a river where decrepit, aging fishing boats were docked. Rather than having town walls, it merely faded into the surrounding farmlands, and the smell of dying fish was everywhere. On a muddy street that curved up to the river's edge, they found a shabby wooden inn, where the innkeeper took Cullen's coin without even a glance at his silver dagger. Since it was market day, the tavern room was crowded with men, a sullen lot by and large, and Jill noticed that remarkably large number of them wore swords. As soon as they were alone, she asked Cullen if Dunmanana were a pirate haven. No, they're all smugglers. Those stinking boats out in the river are faster than they look. They carry in many a pretty thing under the mackerel. Doesn't the local lord stop it? The local lord's in it up to his neck. Now don't you say one word about this out in public, mind. Once the horses were tended, they went down to the market fair. Down by the river, people had set up wooden booths, but many simply displayed their goods on brown cloths thrown onto the ground. There was food of all sorts, cabbages and greens, cheese and eggs, live chickens tied upside down onto poles, suckling pigs and rabbits. Colin bought them each a chunk of roast pork on a stick to eat as they looked at the booths with cloth, pottery, and metalwork. I don't see any fancy lace. Pity, I wanted to buy you some for your birthday. Oh, I don't want that sort of thing. Indeed, then what about a pretty dress? A new doll? Jewelry? You'd be jesting. None of the sort. Here, I know a jeweler in town, and I'll wager he's not even at the fair. Come along. Down near the edge of town where the green commons met the last houses, they came to a little shop with a wooden sign painted with a silver brooch. When Colin pushed open the door, the silver bells jingled melodiously above. The chamber was just a thin slice of a round house cut off by the intricate wickerwork partition. The doorway in the wickerwork was covered by an old green blanket. Otho, Colin called, are you here? I am, a deep voice from within. Would I be leaving the door unlocked if I weren't? The owner of the voice shoved aside the blanket and came out. He was the shortest man Jill had ever seen, just about 5 feet tall, but broad-shouldered and heavily muscled like a miniature blacksmith. He had a thick shock of gray hair, a tidy gray beard, and piercing black eyes. Cullen of Caramore, by the gods, who's this with you? Your son, from the look of him? My daughter, in truth, and I want to buy her a trinket for her birthday. Alas, are you? Otho looked Jill over carefully. Well, so you are, and one old enough to be thinking about her dowry at that. We'd best turn some of your Da's coin into jewels then before he drinks the lot away. Otho led them deep into the workshop, a thick slice of the house. In the center, just under the smoke hole of the roof, were a hearth and a small forge. Off to one side stood long, low workbench scattered with tools, wooden boxes, half-eaten meal of bread, and smoked meat. Lying in the clutter were a handful of small rubies. Cullen picked one up and held it up so it caught the light. Nice stones. They are, but I'll trouble you not to ask where I got them. With a grin, Cullen rolled the ruby back onto the bench. Otho perched on the wood stool and had a thoughtful bite of bread. Brooches, rings, bracelets, he said with his mouth full. Or does she want a jeweled coffer? Earrings, maybe? None of those, truly, but a silver dagger. Jill laughed, a crow of victory, and threw her arms around him. With a sly smile, Cullen untangled himself and gave her a kiss on the cheek. Now that's a strange gift for a lass, Otho said. Not for this little hellcat here. She's badgering her old father here into teaching her swordcraft. Otho turned to Jill in surprise. The gray gnome popped into existence, squatting on the workbench, and laid one long, wary finger on a ruby. Jill reached out and swatted it away, then realized from the way that Otho's eyes were moving that he too could see it. With an injured look, the gnome vanished. Otho gave Jill a bland conspiratorial smile. I have a hair in my mouth. Well, lass, no doubt you want the same falcon device as your da. By the asses of gods, Otho, Colin broke in, it was 14 years ago when you made me my dagger. You've got a cursed long memory. I do. Memory serves a man well if he'll only use it. Now you're in a bit of luck. I've got a dagger all made up, so all I have to do is engrave the device on it. A year or so ago, another silver dagger brought me a lad to pledge to your band. I got the dagger finished, but cursed if the lad didn't go ask questions about fishing boats, and so he never lived to pay me for it. Luckily, I never put on the device, or it'd have been out of a good bit of coin. Late in the afternoon, Jill went back to the smith's to get the finished dagger. She ran greedy hands over the hilt and cautious fingers down the blade. While an ordinary Devery craftsman could have drawn a falcon as a circle for a head on top of a pair of triangles for wings, Otho's work was lifelike, such view detail to give the illusion of feathers, and yet it was only an inch tall. This is truly beautiful, Jill said. The gnome materialized for a look when Jill obligingly held the dagger up. Otho laughed under his breath. You're a strange one, young Jill, seeing the wild folks as clear as day. Oh, I'm strange, am I now? Good Smith, you see them too. So I do, but why I do is my secret and not for the telling. As for you, lass, is there elven blood in your mother's clan? You can tell by looking at him that there's no such thing in Cullen's. What? How could there be? Elves are only a children's tale. Oh, are they now? Well, the elves you hear about are a tale and no more, perhaps, but that's because no one around here knows about the true elves. They are called the Ilsion Lacquer, they are, and if you ever meet one, don't trust him a jot. Flighty they are, all of that lot. Jill smiled politely, but she was sure that Otho must be daft. He put his chin on his hand and considered her. Tell me somewhat, he said at the last. Does it suit you riding with your father? Cullen's a cursed harsh man. Not to me. Well, most of the time not to me, but it's splendid getting to go everywhere and see everything. And what's going to happen when it's time for you to marry? I'll never marry. Otho smiled in pronounced skepticism. Well, some women never marry, Jill said. They get a craft like spinning or such like, and they open a shop. True enough, and maybe you will find the right craft someday. Here, young Jill, I'll tell you a riddle. If ever you find no one, ask him what craft to take. Your pardons, but what? Told you it was a riddle, didn't I? Remember, if ever you find Nev Yin, he'll tell you more. Now you'd best get back to your da before he gives you a slap for dawdling. All the way back into the inn, Jill puzzled over Otho and his riddle both. Finally, she decided that the riddle meant that no one could ever tell her what to do because she'd do exactly as she wanted. Otho himself, however, was not so easily solved. Da, she asked, what sort of man is Otho? Well, what do you mean by that? Well, he doesn't seem like an ordinary man. Colin shrugged in vague irritation. Well, it must be hard on a man being born that short, she said at last. I suppose that's what makes him so gruff and grasping. Just to begin with, what lass would ever have him? Jill supposed that his answer made sense, but still she was left with the feeling that there was something very odd about Otho the silversmith. That evening the tavern room filled up fast with merchants who'd been to the fair and the farmers having the last tankard before they went home. Although the room was hot from the fire in the hearth and the cloud midges swarm around the candle lanterns, Colin showed no indication to leave after dinner. With coin in his pocket he would drink all night, Jill knew, and she got ready to argue with him later to keep him from spending the lot. Eventually 4 riders in the local Lord's warband wearing fox blazons on their shirt came in to drink and chivvy the serving lass. Jill kept a nervous eye on them. 3 of them were laughing and talking, but the 4th stood on the edge of things. Since he looked no older than 15, doubtless he had yet to prove himself in battle or in a brawl. Jill hoped that he wouldn't be stupid enough to challenge Cullen because he was a handsome lad in his way. All at once she realized that he was boldly looking back at her. She grabbed her tankard of ale and buried her nose in it. "Not so fast," Cullen snapped. "My apologies, Da. Here, shall I fetch you another? The tavern man's so busy he never looks our way." Jill got the ale from the tavern man and began making her way back, carefully keeping her eye on the foaming full tankard. When she felt a touch on her shoulder, she looked up to find the young rider grinning at her. "Hold a minute," he said. "Can I ask you somewhat?" "You can, but I might not answer." The other fox rider gathered around and snickered. The lad blushed and went on wavering determination. "No insult, mind, but are you a lad or a lass?" "A lass, but it's nothing to you." The riders laughed. One nudged the lad and whispered, "Oh, go on." "Well, I thought you were a lass because you're so pretty." Jill was caught speechless. "Well, you are," the lad went on, a bit more boldly. "Can I stand you a tankard?" "Now here," it was Cullen striding over. "What's this?" "He was just talking to me, Da." The lad stepped back sharply, stumbling into his friends. "Listen, you young dolt, I happen to be Cullen of Caremore. Ever hear of that name?" The lad's face went pale. The other fox riders jousted each other in their hurry to fall back and leave the lad to face Cullen alone. "I see you have," Cullen said. "Now none of you are going to say one more word to my daughter." "We won't, I swear it." "Good." Cullen turned on Jill. "And you're not saying one more word to them. Get back to the table." Slopping the ale a bit, Jill hurried back to the table and sat down. Cullen stood with his arms folded over his chest while the fox riders unceremoniously ran out the door. Then he came to sit beside her. "You listen to me. The next time a young lout lays a wrong word to you, you walk on by and find me. By the hells, you're getting older, aren't you? I never truly considered how much older before. I never truly noticed how much older before." When their eyes met, Jill felt that she'd somehow become shameful and failed him. She disliked the way his father was looking at her, too, a cold appraisal that made her feel unclean. Abruptly, she looked away and knew that he was as troubled as she was. She sat there miserably and wished that she could talk to her mother. It was only later that she remembered the young riders telling her she was pretty in spite of herself. She was pleased. All right, this is the continuation of Chapter 3. On a day when the trees stood scarlet and cold drizzle turned the streets to muck, Nevin rode into Dunmannon. He rented a chamber in the inn, stabled his horse and pack mule, then wrapped himself in his patched cloak, and hurried to the shop of Otho the silversmith. For reasons of his own, the dreamer watched over the band of silver daggers, since most of them were decent enough lads who had only committed one grave fault. They came in handy for those rare times when Dwemer needed some help from the sword. Nevin knew every smith in the kingdom who served them, though few were as strange as Otho, a dwarf in a long exile from the kingdoms of his race far to the north. When Nevin appeared at his door, the silversmith greeted him heartily and took him into the workshop, where a fire burned in the hearth. "Would you care for a bit of mulled ale, my lord?" "I would. These old bones are feeling damp." Otho allowed himself a smile at the jest. They had after all known each other for some 200 years. Nevin pulled the only chair in the room up to the fire and held out his hands to the heat while Otho bustled around, filling a metal flagon with ale from a barrel by the wall, adding a stick of bardic cinnamon, then popping on a lid to keep the ashes out when he stood the flagon in the coals. I was hoping you'd ride my way, Otho said. I might have a bit of news for you. That lass of yours, the one you've been vexing yourself over for so long, is it time for her to be reborn again? She's been reborn, actually. Here, have you seen her? I may have, I may not. I don't have the second sight, my lord, or the dweemer neither, as well as you know. But a passing, strange little lass rode my way this summer. Her name was Jill, and oh, she'd been born some 13 summers ago, I'd say. Her father is Silver Dagger, you see, and he has his daughter riding with him. It's truly strange to see a human being treat his child so well, but that's neither here nor there. His name is Colin of Cremor. Ever heard of him? The man they say is the best swordsman in Devery? The very one, and he is, too. His mark is a striking falcon. Oh, by the gods, it could be. It just could be. Otho got a clot of rags and gingerly took the flagon from the fire. Then he poured the steaming ale into a pair of tankards. 13 would mark the right number of years since I saw that vision, Niven thought, and it would be like Geraint to end up with that dagger in his belt. If she were wandering with the silver dagger, it was no wonder he'd never found her in all these long years of trying. Suddenly he felt weary, for all of Colin Cremor had great glory. It would be a hard job to track him down. Otho handed him a tankard. When they left, they rode north. Colin took a hire with a merchant who was taking a caravan of our special imports into Devery. Special imports indeed. Here, Otho, when are you going to mend your ways? It's your people, not mine, who make such stinking fuss over excises and the king's tax. Although Nevin was tempted to ride after the pair, by the time of year it would already be snowing up north, and for all he knew, Colin would be riding elsewhere. Nevin decided to carry out his original plan of returning to his home in western Eldid for the winter. After all, he reminded himself, this Jill might not even be Bragawin reborn. She wasn't the only soul in the kingdom marked for Dwemer, and the falcon device might well be a simple coincidence. Besides, he also had Lord Rodri Mailweed of Aberwin to consider. He was as much a part of Nevin's weird as Bragawin was. Being as Lord Blaine, he died so needlessly that night, thanks to Prince Galron's fault. Although Nevin had been planning on riding straight to Aberwin, he took the precaution of scrying Rodri out first, and so saved himself a wasted trip. When he called up Rodri's image in the burning coals of the fire, he saw the lad out riding in the forest preserve of the Gorberts of Aberwin, a stretch of virgin forest near a little town of Belgrade. Nevin assumed that he would have no chance to meet the young lord simply because the preserve was closed to all but the Gorberts' guests, but even so he went to Belglade on the off chance that Rodri might ride into town for some reason. There as he later came to realize, the lords of Weird took a hand in the matter. The people of Belgrade and the outlying farmers both knew the honored Nevin because he was the only source of medical care that most of them had. The tavern man insisted on putting him up for free and then rattled off a list of symptoms about pains in his joints. For the next week, Nevin had little time to think about his tangled weird, as family after family came to buy his herbs and ask his advice. On the 8th morning, Nevin had just gone out to the muddy tavern yard for a bit of sun when a rider trotted up in a splash of muck. He wore a blue cloak blazoned with the dragon device of Aberwin. "Morrow, good age sir," the rider said. "I hear there's a good herbman in town. Do you know him?" "I am him, lad. What's your trouble?" I've just come from the lodge. Lord Rodri's cursed ill. Talking all the while, the rider helped Nevin load his supplies onto his mule. Rodri had been caught out in the rain and stubbornly gone on hunting even though he was soaking wet. The only people at the lodge with him were a pair of servants and 5 of his father's men, none of whom knew the first thing about physics, psychics, Physick, psychic? I don't know. And that's his lordship doing out here this time of the year anyway, Nevin said. Oh, well, sir, I'm not free to say, but he got into a bit of trouble with his older brother. Not that it was serious. Although the Gorbert probably considered his hunting lodge to be charmingly rustic, it was imposing as many a dun of lesser lord. In the middle of the cobbled and well-drained ward rose a 3-story block, surrounded by enough outbuildings and stables to house a party of 100 guests. An aged manservant led Nevin up to the 2nd floor of Rodri's chamber, sparsely furnished with 1 carved chest, a bed with a faded hangings, and his lordship's shield hanging on the wall. Although there was a brazier heaped with coals glowing in the middle of the room, the damp seeped out of the very walls. Ye gods, Nevin snapped. Isn't there a chamber with a proper hearth? There is, but his lordship won't let us move in. Indeed, then I'll deal with his lordship. When Nevin pulled back the bed curtains, Rodri looked up at him with gummy eyes. At 16, he'd grown into a lanky lad, getting close to 6 feet tall, and still as handsome as ever. Or he would have been handsome if his hair weren't plastered to his forehead with sweat, his lips not badly cracked that they were bleeding, and his cheeks not flushed with hectic glow. Who are you? Rodri mumbled. An herbman. Your men fetched me. Ah, curse them, I don't need. He began to cough so violently that his body went rigid. He propped himself up on one elbow and spasmed, choking until Nevin grabbed him and hauled him upright. Finally, he spat out green rumen. You don't need me, Nevin said dryly. I may only be a commoner, your lordship, but you're following my orders. Rodri's lips twitched in a faint smile as he trembled with fever. Nevin laid him down again and turned to the frightened manservant. Get that chamber with the hearth warm, then pile extra pillows on the bed and start heating me a big kettle of water. When you've done all that, send a man back to Aberwin with a message. Gorbert Tingbury needs to know that his son is ill. All afternoon, Nevin worked over his patient. He fed Rodri infusions of coltsfoot and L-camp to bring up the phlegm, hyssop and pinoloyal to make him sweat, and quaking aspen as a general febrifuge. And the medicines cleaned his humors. Rodri coughed until it made Nevin's own sides ache to hear him, but at last he began to breathe freely instead of gasping for breath. Nevin let him lie down then, propped up on a mound of pillows. The fever still played on his face like a firelight. My thanks, Rodri whispered. Owen, does he still live? For a moment, Nevin was too puzzled to answer him. Then the memory came back of another life when he'd tended battle wounds on the body this soul wore then, and a friend lay dying nearby. He does, lad. Just rest. Rodri smiled and felt stray asleep, so Nevin thought he's reacting to my presence, is he? In the feverish stare, Rodri had somehow come across his long-buried memory. All the next day, Nevin brooded over his patient, forcing him to drink bitter infusions of herbs, even though Rodri swore at him and complained that he couldn't get another loathsome mouthful down. Finally, that evening, the fever broke. Rodri was well enough to eat a little soup, which Nevin fed him a mouthful at a time. My thanks, Rodri said when he was finished. It's a marvel, you turning up like this. Do you remember meeting me on the Cantry Road all those years ago? I do, truly. It's eerie. I was just trying to be courteous, and I never dreamt you'd save my life someday. I must have cursed good luck. So you must, so you must. When Rodri fell asleep, Nevin went down to the great hall for his dinner. The men in the young lord's warband insisted on treating Nevin like a hero. They brought him his food like pages and crowded around to thank him while he ate. One of them, a beefy lad named Prade, even insisted on bringing Nevin a goblet of mead. Here, good sir, if you ever need our aid for anything, me and the lads will ride out of our way to give it. My thanks. I take it your men honor Lord Rodri highly. We do. He's a young yet, but he's got more honor than any lord in Eldid. Well and good then, and what of Lord Rise, the heir? Prade hesitated, glancing this way and that, and he dropped his voice when he answered. Don't spread this around like, but there's plenty of men in Aberwin who wish Lord Rodri had been born first and not second. Prade bowed and hurried away before he could say anything else indiscreet. As Nevin thought over what he said, he felt the cold Dwemer morning ripping down his back. There was trouble coming in Aberwin. Suddenly he had a brief flash of a vision, saw swords flashing in the summer sun as Rodri led a wedge of men into a hard-fought battle. When the vision faded, Nevin felt sick at heart. Was there going to be a rebellion to put Rodri in the Gorbert chair when Tangier died? Perhaps. Dwemer warnings were always vague, leaving the recipient puzzle out their meaning. Yet he could only guess that once again he would have important work to do in Aberwin when the time came. The guests turned to a certainty late on the next afternoon. Nevin was up in Rodri's chambers when a manservant rushed in with news that Rodri's mother, Lady Lovian of Aberwin, had arrived with a small retinue. In a few minutes, the wife of the most powerful man in Eldon swept into the room. She threw her travel-stained plaid coat to the waiting servant and ran to Rodri's bedside. A solid woman in her early 40s, Lovian had an imposing beauty, her raven dark hair just streaked with gray, her cornflower blue eyes as large and perfect as her son's. My poor little lad, she said, laying a hand on his forehead. Thanks be the goddess you're not fevered anymore. The goddess sent a good herbman, Mother. You didn't need to ride all this way just for me. Don't babble nonsense. Lovian turned to Nevin. My thanks, good sir. I'll see you're well paid for all of this. It was my honor, my lady. I'm just thankful that I was close at hand. Nevin left them alone, but later he returned to find Rodri asleep and Lovian sitting by his bedside. When Nevin bowed to her, she came over to talk where they wouldn't be waking him. I've spoken to the servants, good Nevin. They told me that they feared for his life until you came. I won't lie to you, my lady. He was very ill indeed. That's why I thought you should be notified. Lovian nodded, her mouth slack with worry, and in the fading light she looked intensely familiar. Nevin allowed himself to slip into the Dwemer sight and saw her clearly. Rada, bound to Blaine again as his mother to son. At that moment she recognized him as well, and her eyes grew puzzled even as she smiled. Now here, do you ever ride to Aberwin? I must have seen you before, but surely I'd remember a man with such unusual name. Oh, my lady, you may have seen me when you rode by in the street or such like. I've never been presented to a woman of your rank. Nevin felt like laughing in triumph. Here they were, the three of them come together at the same time as he'd had news of the lass who might be Bragawin. Surely the time was ripening. Surely his weird was leading him to one of those crisis points when he would have the chance to untangle it. In his excitement, he forgot himself badly. The fire was growing low. He tossed on a couple of big logs, then waved his hand over them. When the flames leapt up, he heard Lovian gasp, then spun around to face her. My apologies, my lady, for startling you. No apology needed, my lord. Luvian pronounced the honorific slowly and deliberately. I'm most honored that a man like you would stoop to treating my son for a fever. I see that my lady doesn't dismiss tales of Dwemer as nonsense fit only to amuse children. Her ladyship has seen too many odd things in her life to do anything of the sort. For a moment they studied each other like a pair of fences. Then Nevin felt the Dwemer prod him, force him to speak as if his mouth would burn if he didn't speak out the truth. It's very important for Rodri to live to his manhood. I cannot tell you why, but his weird is Eldon's weird, and I would like to be able to keep an eye on the lad from now on. Luvian went tense, her face pale in the leaping firelight. Finally she nodded in agreement. His lordship is always welcome at the court of Aberwin, and if he prefers, I shall keep up the fiction that his shabby old ermine amuses me. I do prefer, and my thanks. That night Nevin stayed up late, leaning on the windowsill of his guest chamber and watching the moon sail through the wind-torn and scuttled clouds. He had been sent to his post like a soldier, and he would do nothing but obey. From now on he would stay in Eldon and trust that the lords of the Weird would send Bragawin to him when the time was ripe. Deep in his heart he felt true hope for the first time in hundreds of years. Great things were on the move. He could only wait and watch their coming. Okay, that's the end of chapter 3. It's in 2 sections. I'm going to try to put them into one video. It's going to be a little long, but anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.